Now let's begin Unit 2, Mise en place. Our first lesson will be cooking terminology. In this unit, we will be going over some common and often confusing cooking terms. Note that this is by no means an exhaustive list, just a few things you will encounter along the way. Also, this is a lesson in understanding and interpreting, not in actual cooking skills. So if you want lessons on how to chop, sift, baste, or broil, check out the resources in the description. There are tons of helpful videos on how to hone these skills before you start cooking. Anyways, let's get into it. Let's start with some cutting terms. I may sound like a broken record at this point, but the way you cut ingredients really does matter. It can affect the texture of the dish and, more importantly, the taste. The key with cutting lies in the size of the cuts. First, there's chopping. Chopped usually means to cut your vegetables into larger squares. Generally, this means 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, but a recipe may tell you exactly how big to make those chunks. Chopping usually has more leeway on the exact size than other methods. Dicing is basically small chops. That would mean around 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch chunks. Oftentimes, you'll get specific instructions like dice into 1/4 inch squares in a recipe. Now, when a recipe tells you to mince something, it wants you to cut it as small as you can with a knife. You'll run into mincing every now and again, but most commonly with garlic. Sliced is exactly what it sounds like. For slices, just cut vertically down on the vegetables, so long ways, and you're all set. Typically, you can slice these as thick or thin as you prefer, but again, the recipe will often tell you a recommendation of how thick or thin the slice should be. Moving on to a few oven terms. So, baking. Baking is all about having a consistent temperature around your food and cooking it on all of its sides. So, when you bake something, the entire oven reaches a similar temperature and cooks the entirety of your food as a whole. Broiling, on the other hand, works by exposing your food to direct heat, much like you would experience through a grill. A broiler reaches a temperature around 550 degrees. When you're broiling, you want to get your food as close to the flame as possible. This means if you have a broiler inside of your oven, put it close to the top, where you can see the flames nearly touching the food. Or, if you have a separate broiler at the bottom of your oven, you can stick the item in the drawer to broil the top in the same way. Be careful. Having food this close to the flame means that it can quickly go from delicious and golden brown to absolutely burnt, and there is potential for fire. That's why you should always have a fire extinguisher in your kitchen at all times when cooking, but also keep an eye on your food while it's broiling. I usually keep the oven cracked, and if there's a light available, keep it on so that food doesn't become overbroiled. Usually, you'll broil for no more than a minute or two to get the desired crisp on the outside of your food. Now, we'll move to talking about cooking on the stove. So, first, water. To keep a pot simmering, you want to bring that to a boil, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then reduce the heat slightly to a point where you don't see bubbles anymore. The water should be around 200 degrees, but you don't want to let it get to 212 degrees. You'll know when it's at that temperature because then you'll be boiling. And boiling water is when you turn the heat up to the highest possible until bubbles start to form in the water. When you're cooking on the stove in a pan, there are a couple of terms that you might come across. Sautéing involves cooking food over a medium to high heat with some sort of fat, usually oil or butter, in a pan. You'll usually move the food around as you sauté it. Your goal is to get the food brown, but not burnt. Pan frying is when you cook larger chunks of food, sometimes chicken, other times steak, over a medium heat. This usually involves a larger amount of fat for a longer time. Now, pan frying is deep frying. Deep frying is a completely separate thing that should definitely be done in a larger pan and when you feel more comfortable cooking on a stove. For pan frying, the oil in your pan should be no more than halfway up the side. Next is sweating. Sweating in cooking is a gentle heating of vegetables in a little bit of fat with frequent stirring to ensure that any liquid that comes out of the vegetables will eventually evaporate. Sweating usually results in tender, often translucent pieces. You'll often sweat vegetables at the beginning of the recipe to impart more flavor before adding other ingredients. Searing is when you simply heat the outside of the food, usually meat, poultry, or fish, at a high temperature until a caramelized crust forms on the outside. Again, we're looking for brown, not burnt. So, in general, when cooking on high heats, just be sure to always check and make sure it's not going too far. Finally, braising. Braising usually starts with searing your food at a pretty high temperature and then finishing it in a covered pot at a very low temperature for a long amount of time with some amount of liquid that will probably impart some delicious flavor. So, referring to the pans, there's also the question of which pan do you use? For boiling and simmering, anything as small as a saucepan to as large as a pot or Dutch oven will work best. The more liquid, the higher the sides of the pot should be. For sautéing, pan frying, or searing, you will want to use a pan. This can be anything from a skillet to a frying pan to a sauté pan. They're all very similar with slight differences, usually in the shape and sometimes in the materials. You might hear words like non-stick, all-clad, cast iron, which can give you clues on which pan is best. Again, always look to your recipe. It should be able to guide you in that case. I'm only covering a few popular terms, but this is only the tip of the iceberg. Check out Home Ec 101's list of terms, links in the description, to get a better idea of some additional terms before moving on to the next section.